Your soulmate cried loudly last night. What caused it will shock you. Don't skip this, stay with me for a moment, because what happened last night wasn't weakness, and it wasn't random. Your soulmate didn't cry quietly into a pillow or hide tears behind distraction. They cried loudly, the kind of crying that comes from something breaking open after being held shut for too long. And what caused it wasn't a single event. It was a realization that finally caught up to them when the world went quiet. Listen carefully, because all day yesterday they were functioning. Smiling when needed. Answering messages. Doing what life required. On the outside, nothing looked wrong. But underneath that surface, something had been building for weeks, maybe months. A pressure made of unsaid words, unresolved feelings, and the growing awareness that something important was slipping away. Stay right here, because the trigger wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a confrontation. It was silence. The kind of silence that arrives late at night when there's no noise left to drown out the truth. When distractions stop working. When you're left alone with your thoughts and the memories you've been avoiding. Listen closely now, because your soulmate replayed moments involving you. Not the obvious ones, the small ones. Times when you almost spoke. Times when they almost asked. Times when something real hovered in the air but neither of you named it. Those moments came back with clarity last night, sharper than they've ever felt before. Stay with me, because this is where the shock lives. They finally understood that the distance between you wasn't caused by lack of love. It was caused by fear, avoidance, and silence on both sides. And realizing that love didn't fail, but communication did, hit them harder than any breakup ever could. Listen carefully, because regret arrived all at once. Not the shallow kind, but the deep, body-heavy regret that makes your chest ache. Regret for not asking how you really felt. Regret for assuming you were okay. Regret for choosing comfort over courage. That regret didn't whisper, it crashed. Stay right here, because they also felt something else that surprised them, grief. Grief not just over what might be lost, but over what was never fully lived. The version of the connection that could have existed if honesty had arrived sooner. Grief for the emotional closeness they now realize they wanted more than they admitted. Listen closely now, because they cried for you in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to before. Not because you hurt them intentionally, but because they finally saw how much you mattered. How much your presence changed their inner world. How much your absence, or emotional distance, has been felt more deeply than they let on. Stay with me, because this crying wasn't about drama. It was about truth catching up. When someone spends a long time avoiding their own feelings, those feelings don't disappear. They wait. And last night, they demanded to be felt all at once. Listen carefully, because your soulmate realized something that shook them. You may have been waiting for them to show up emotionally, while they were waiting for things to feel safer. Both of you waiting. Both of you quiet. And that mutual silence created a gap neither of you intended. Stay right here, because this realization came with fear. Fear that it might be too late. Fear that you've already emotionally stepped back. Fear that even if they speak now, the moment may have passed. That fear mixed with regret is what broke them open. Listen closely now, because they didn't cry because they're weak. They cried because they finally stopped running from what they feel. Running works during the day. At night, when the body is tired, truth wins. Stay with me, because they questioned themselves through those tears. Asked why they didn't speak sooner. Why vulnerability felt so dangerous. Why they thought staying emotionally guarded was safer than risking real connection. Those questions didn't come with answers last night, just honesty. Listen carefully, because part of what shocked them was realizing that you may have felt alone while caring deeply. That thought hurts in a way pride never prepares you for. Knowing someone you love may have felt unseen because of your inaction is a heavy thing to carry. Stay right here, because this is where the crying became uncontrollable. Not because of you directly, but because of who they were being in the connection. They saw themselves clearly for the first time. Saw the cost of emotional distance. Saw how silence can wound just as deeply as words. Listen closely now, because after the crying slowed, something else settled in. Determination. Not loud resolve, but a quiet understanding that something has to change. That avoiding the truth is no longer an option. That even if speaking now is terrifying, staying silent hurts more. Stay with me, because this doesn't mean they'll magically say all the right things today. Growth doesn't work that way. But it does mean they crossed an internal line last night. Once you fully feel something, you can't go back to pretending you don't. Listen carefully, because you may have felt something too. A heaviness. A sudden wave of emotion you couldn't explain. Trouble sleeping. Thinking about them out of nowhere. That wasn't coincidence. Emotional connections don't end at logic, they move through intuition. Stay right here, because your soulmate's tears weren't about guilt alone. They were about love finally being acknowledged without defense. Love without excuses. Love without silence. And that realization shook them to the core. Listen closely now, because what caused those tears wasn't one mistake. It was the understanding that love requires voice, presence, and courage, and they hadn't fully shown up yet. That understanding hurts, but it also opens the door to change. Stay with me, because this is only the beginning of the shift. Tears are not the end, they're the release that makes honesty possible. What happens next depends on whether courage follows emotion. Listen carefully, because whether they reach out or take time, last night changed them. They can't unknow what they felt. They can't unknow how much you matter. And they can't unknow the cost of staying quiet anymore. Stay right here, because this story isn't finished. Last night was the breaking point. The next part is the turning point. Breathe. You weren't imagining the connection. You weren't wrong to feel distance. And you weren't insignificant in their life. They cried because something real finally surfaced. If this resonated deeply, stay connected. Subscribe and remain here, because the next part reveals what happens after the tears dry, and how that emotional breakthrough begins to reshape everything between you. Stay with me, because what came after the crying was even heavier than the tears themselves. When the sobs finally slowed and the room went quiet again, your soulmate didn't feel relief. They felt exposed. Like something inside them had been pulled into the light that they could no longer push back down. Crying does that, it strips away denial. And once denial is gone, you're left alone with truth, and truth doesn't rush to comfort you. Listen carefully, because after last night, sleep didn't come easily for them. They lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything not from anger or nostalgia, but from honesty. Honest enough to hurt. Honest enough to admit they had been emotionally holding back, even while convincing themselves they were protecting the connection. That realization doesn't feel noble when it finally lands. It feels like loss. Stay right here, because this is where the shock deepened. They realized the crying wasn't just about missing you. It was about missing who they were when they felt close to you. The version of themselves that was more open, more present, more alive. Somewhere along the way, they traded that version for emotional safety, and now they're grieving both you and themselves. Listen closely now, because guilt began to take a different shape. It wasn't just, "I should have done better." It became, "I knew I was holding back, and I still chose comfort." That kind of guilt doesn't scream. It sinks. It settles in the chest and makes every distraction feel hollow. Music didn't help. Scrolling didn't help. Even sleep felt like avoidance. Stay with me, because they started asking questions they had avoided for a long time. Why does vulnerability feel like danger? Why do I wait until things are slipping away to admit how much they matter? Why did I think silence was safer than honesty? These questions don't come with easy answers. They come with discomfort, and growth always begins there. Listen carefully, because your soulmate also realized something painful about you. They realized you were likely carrying your own weight quietly. That you may have been waiting, hoping they'd step forward emotionally. That you might have felt unseen while still caring deeply. That thought hit them hard. Knowing someone you love may have felt alone because of your inaction leaves a mark. Stay right here, because this is where the crying turned into resolve, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that sits quietly and changes how you see things. They understood that even if they reach out now, things won't magically go back to how they were. Trust doesn't rebuild through emotion alone. It rebuilds through consistency. And that realization scared them almost as much as the tears did. Listen closely now, because fear is still there. Fear that you've already moved on emotionally. Fear that they missed their window. Fear that even if they speak now, it might reopen wounds instead of healing them. That fear doesn't mean they don't care. It means they care enough to be afraid of causing more damage. Stay with me, because you might think they'd feel motivated immediately. But what they felt first was humility. The kind that quiets you. Makes you realize you don't get to control outcomes just because you feel regret. Makes you understand that love doesn't guarantee access once distance has formed. Listen carefully, because they also noticed something else last night, the pattern. Not just with you, but with other connections in their life. How they retreat emotionally when things start to matter. How they avoid difficult conversations until the cost is high. Seeing that pattern clearly is unsettling. It forces responsibility. Stay right here, because responsibility is heavy. It means they can't blame timing, circumstances, or misunderstanding anymore. It means acknowledging that their choices, especially the choice to stay quiet, played a role in what's happening now. That acknowledgement hurts, but it also brings clarity. Listen closely now, because clarity changes how they think about reaching out. They're no longer fantasizing about a perfect conversation that fixes everything. They're thinking about honesty without guarantees. About saying something even if it doesn't lead to reunion. About speaking because silence feels wrong now, not because they expect a specific response. Stay with me, because this is where courage starts forming. Not as confidence, but as willingness. Willingness to be seen as flawed. Willingness to risk rejection. Willingness to face the possibility that they may have to live with regret if they don't speak. Listen carefully, because you might feel this shift too. You may have felt a strange heaviness lift slightly, or a sudden wave of emotion you couldn't explain. Emotional bonds don't operate on logic alone. When one side finally lets truth surface, the other often feels it in subtle ways. Stay right here, because this doesn't mean you should wait or hope or put your life on pause. This is not about timing your next move around their pain. This is about understanding that what you felt wasn't imagined. The distance was real. The connection was real. And last night confirmed that. Listen closely now, because your soulmate is beginning to understand that love isn't proven by tears, it's proven by what happens after. Tears open the door. Action decides whether someone walks through it. They know that now. And that knowledge is sitting heavily with them. Stay with me, because part of them is still scared they don't know how to show up differently. Wanting to change and knowing how to change are not the same thing. That gap is intimidating. But acknowledging it is the first step toward growth. Listen carefully, because last night also taught them something else. Suppressing emotion doesn't make you strong. It delays pain. And delayed pain always collects interest. What they felt all at once was months of avoidance crashing together. Stay right here, because this is why the crying was loud. It wasn't about one night. It was about everything they hadn't allowed themselves to feel until now. Everything they postponed. Everything they rationalized. Everything they feared. Listen closely now, because they didn't wake up this morning feeling lighter. They woke up feeling changed. Quieter. More thoughtful. Less reactive. When someone crosses an internal line like that, they don't go back to who they were before. Stay with me, because what happens next is uncertain, but one thing isn't. They can't unknow how deeply this connection affected them. They can't unknow the cost of staying emotionally distant. And they can't unknow that silence is no longer neutral. Listen carefully, because whether they reach out today, tomorrow, or later, last night marked a turning point inside them. Tears don't solve problems, but they reveal them. And once a problem is revealed, it demands a response. Stay right here, because this part of the story isn't about predicting what they'll do. It's about honoring what was felt. Those tears weren't manipulation. They weren't weakness. They were truth finally surfacing without armor. Breathe. Let that settle. You weren't wrong to feel distance. You weren't wrong to feel something unresolved. And you weren't insignificant in their emotional world. They cried because something real was at stake, and because they finally let themselves feel it. If this spoke to you, stay connected. Subscribe and remain here, because the next part explores what happens when someone moves from tears to action, and how to protect your heart no matter which direction that action takes. Stay with me, because this part isn't about tears anymore, it's about the quiet aftermath that no one talks about. After the crying, after the realization, after the emotional collapse that cracked something open, your soulmate entered a strange, unfamiliar space. Not sadness exactly. Not peace either. It's the space where denial is gone, but certainty hasn't arrived yet. And that space is uncomfortable in a deeply human way. Listen carefully, because the morning after didn't feel dramatic for them. There was no sudden motivation, no clear plan, no cinematic resolve. Instead, there was heaviness. A dull weight in the chest that made ordinary things feel slower. Getting out of bed took more effort. Small tasks felt louder than usual. That's what happens when emotions finally catch up to the body, everything feels slightly off. They kept thinking about you, but not in the way you might expect. Not obsessively. Not romantically. They thought about you in fragments. Your tone. Your pauses. The way you'd respond when something mattered to you but you didn't want to push. They noticed things they overlooked before. Things that only make sense in hindsight, once the emotional blindfold is gone. Stay right here, because this is where the shock deepens. They realized how often you met them where they were instead of asking them to meet you where you needed. How often you softened yourself to keep things smooth. At the time, it felt like ease. Now, it feels like loss. Because ease built on silence eventually turns into emptiness. Listen closely now, because guilt has shifted again. It's no longer sharp or overwhelming. It's steady. The kind of guilt that doesn't paralyze, but doesn't let you escape either. It follows them through the day, quietly reminding them that something important was neglected, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Stay with me, because fear is finally being named for what it was. Fear of intimacy. Fear of being responsible for someone else's feelings. Fear of saying the wrong thing and breaking something fragile. Ironically, that fear did more damage than honesty ever would have. And realizing that hurts in a very specific way. Listen carefully, because they're also noticing how much energy they spent avoiding discomfort. Avoiding deep conversations. Avoiding emotional risk. Avoiding moments where they might have had to show up imperfectly. That avoidance felt like self-protection at the time. Now it feels like self-sabotage. Stay right here, because this realization doesn't come with self-hatred. It comes with sadness. Sadness for the moments that slipped by unclaimed. Sadness for the closeness that could have grown if courage had arrived sooner. Sadness for the version of themselves they might have been if they hadn't kept choosing safety over truth. Listen closely now, because something else is happening inside them too: comparison. They're comparing who they were with you to who they've been since pulling back. And the comparison isn't flattering. Life feels flatter now. Less color. Less emotional depth. Not because you completed them, but because you invited them into a version of themselves they stopped accessing. Stay with me, because this is where loneliness shows up, not the obvious kind, but the existential kind. The kind where you're surrounded by people or noise and still feel disconnected. That loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about realizing you shut out something real, and now you're living with the echo. Listen carefully, because they're also questioning their own patterns. Asking whether this is something they've done before, waited too long, stayed quiet too long, realized too late. Those questions don't feel comfortable. They threaten the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. But they're necessary for growth. Stay right here, because growth doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing. It shakes your identity. Makes you unsure of your instincts. Makes you wonder how many times you chose comfort disguised as logic. That uncertainty is part of the process. It means something is changing. Listen closely now, because they're also aware of time in a new way. Not clock time, but emotional time. The time it takes for distance to become habit. The time it takes for someone to stop waiting. The time it takes for a connection to shift from active to memory. That awareness is frightening because time doesn't pause for reflection. Stay with me, because this is where urgency quietly enters, not panic, but awareness. Awareness that if something is going to be said, it can't wait forever. Awareness that silence now is no longer neutral, it's a choice. And every day that passes is another message being sent, whether intended or not. Listen carefully, because they're also thinking about what honesty would actually require. Not a grand confession. Not an emotional flood. But accountability. The kind that doesn't ask for reassurance in return. The kind that says, I see what I did. I understand how it affected you. That level of honesty feels vulnerable in a way they're not used to. Stay right here, because vulnerability after avoidance feels terrifying. When you've built identity around being composed, admitting emotional failure feels like collapse. But collapse is sometimes necessary to rebuild something real. Listen closely now, because they're also afraid of something else, that even if they speak now, it won't change anything. That you've already adjusted. Already begun detaching. Already stopped waiting. That fear is heavy because it forces them to confront the consequences of delay. Stay with me, because this is where regret becomes fully formed. Not dramatic, not explosive, just solid. The kind you carry with you. The kind that makes you wish you could rewind not to change events, but to change yourself. Listen carefully, because there's also respect emerging. Respect for you. Respect for how you handled things quietly. Respect for the patience you showed. And with that respect comes a painful realization: patience shouldn't have been required. You shouldn't have had to wait in silence. Stay right here, because this respect complicates things. It makes reaching out feel riskier. It raises the stakes. It removes the option of casual communication. They know that if they speak now, it has to be real. Anything less would be another form of harm. Listen closely now, because this is where inner conflict intensifies. The desire to reach out battles the fear of reopening wounds. The longing to be honest battles the fear of being too late. And sitting inside that conflict is exhausting. Stay with me, because exhaustion has a way of forcing truth. When you're too tired to pretend, too tired to strategize, too tired to perform, you're left with what's real. And what's real for them is this: they care more than they allowed themselves to admit, and they regret the silence deeply. Listen carefully, because this doesn't mean they're suddenly ready or capable of perfect action. It means they're awake now. Awake to the cost of avoidance. Awake to the depth of the connection. Awake to their own limitations. Stay right here, because awakening doesn't guarantee outcome, but it guarantees awareness. And awareness changes everything, even when it doesn't fix everything. Listen closely now, because you might be feeling something similar on your side. A strange calm mixed with sadness. A sense that something important has shifted, even if nothing has been said yet. That's not imagination. That's emotional alignment responding to truth. Stay with me, because the bond you shared didn't disappear. It transformed. It moved from possibility into consequence. And consequences are where growth happens, even when they hurt. Listen carefully, because this stage is not about reunion or closure yet. It's about reckoning. Reckoning with self. Reckoning with choices. Reckoning with what silence costs when love is involved. Stay right here, because whatever happens next, this part matters. This is the point where patterns can change. Or repeat. Where courage can follow awareness, or avoidance can take over again. Listen closely now, because you're not responsible for what they choose next. You never were. Their tears, their realizations, their growth, all of that belongs to them. Your responsibility is to yourself. Stay with me, because you're learning that love doesn't mean waiting forever. It doesn't mean staying quiet indefinitely. It doesn't mean carrying emotional weight alone. Love without mutual presence becomes pain. Listen carefully, because if they do reach out, it will come from this place, not from impulse, but from reflection. And if they don't, that too will come from this place. Either way, the truth has already done its work. Stay right here, because you're no longer in the dark. Something real surfaced. Something honest was felt. And that alone changes the story. Breathe. Let this settle gently. You mattered enough to break through their defenses. You mattered enough to shake their sense of self. And you mattered enough to be remembered in the quiet aftermath, when no one else was watching. What happens next will reveal not just what they feel, but what they're willing to face. Stay with me, because this part is where the weight of everything finally settles into something real and unavoidable. After the tears, after the quiet reckoning, after the long hours of thinking without answers, your soulmate reaches a point where they can no longer pretend they are untouched. Life starts moving again on the outside, but inside them, something is permanently different. They carry a new awareness now, and it follows them everywhere. Listen carefully, because this awareness doesn't shout. It whispers at inconvenient moments. In the middle of routine conversations. While driving with the radio on. While laughing with people who don't know what's going on beneath the surface. They feel it as a subtle pull in the chest, a reminder that something meaningful was mishandled. Not through cruelty, but through fear and delay. Stay right here, because they begin noticing how often they reach for distraction and how little it works now. The things that once numbed them don't fully land anymore. Scrolling feels empty. Small talk feels hollow. Even moments of enjoyment are followed by a quiet drop, like something unresolved is waiting in the background. That unresolved feeling is you. Not you as a person, but you as a truth they didn't face soon enough. Listen closely now, because memory starts behaving differently. Instead of replaying moments to romanticize or regret them, memory begins teaching. They see scenes with clarity they didn't have before. The pauses in your voice. The times you softened your needs. The way you stayed when it would have been easier to pull away. Those moments now carry meaning, and that meaning hurts. Stay with me, because this is where self-honesty deepens. They stop framing the story in ways that protect their ego. They stop saying, "It just didn't work," and start admitting, "I didn't show up fully." That admission doesn't come easily. It requires letting go of the idea that intentions matter more than impact. Listen carefully, because impact is what they're facing now. The impact of emotional distance. The impact of unanswered moments. The impact of waiting too long to speak. Understanding impact is heavier than feeling guilt, because it asks for responsibility without a clear way to fix things. Stay right here, because responsibility changes how they view the possibility of reaching out. They no longer imagine a conversation where everything is smoothed over. They imagine one where they might have to sit with your pain without defending themselves. That possibility is intimidating, especially for someone who's used to emotional control. Listen closely now, because fear shows up again, but differently. It's not the fear of vulnerability itself. It's the fear of realizing that vulnerability might not be enough anymore. That fear is humbling. It strips away fantasy and leaves only reality. Stay with me, because reality also brings respect. Respect for the emotional space you held. Respect for the patience you showed. Respect for the fact that you didn't demand, manipulate, or force closeness. That respect complicates things, because it makes the silence feel heavier in hindsight. Listen carefully, because they're also noticing a pattern in themselves, waiting until emotions become unbearable before addressing them. Waiting until something cracks before paying attention. That pattern isn't about laziness or carelessness, it's about avoidance learned long ago. And seeing that pattern clearly is uncomfortable. Stay right here, because discomfort is doing its work. It's forcing them to ask whether they want to keep living this way, always reacting late, always processing after loss, always realizing after the fact. That question doesn't have an immediate answer, but it lingers. Listen closely now, because this is where time becomes sharp. They realize how quickly emotional distance becomes permanent if left unaddressed. How people adapt. How hearts adjust. How silence slowly trains someone not to wait anymore. That realization creates urgency, but also restraint. Stay with me, because urgency alone doesn't lead to wisdom. They don't want to reach out impulsively, driven by fear or loneliness. They want to understand what they'd actually be offering if they spoke now. Not promises they can't keep. Not emotion without follow-through. Something real. Listen carefully, because this internal debate is exhausting. Part of them wants to say everything all at once. Another part knows that dumping emotion without structure can cause more harm than healing. Sitting between those impulses is uncomfortable, but necessary. Stay right here, because you might be feeling something similar on your side. A sense of distance mixed with awareness. A calm that feels strange. A readiness to accept whatever truth arrives. That readiness didn't come from indifference, it came from growth. Listen closely now, because growth rarely happens on the same timeline for two people. You may already be standing in clarity while they're still finding their footing. That mismatch hurts, but it's real. And pretending it isn't only delays acceptance. Stay with me, because acceptance doesn't mean approval. It means seeing things as they are instead of how you wish they were. And seeing clearly allows you to stop bending yourself to fit uncertainty. Listen carefully, because your soulmate senses this shift too. Even without words, they feel that you're no longer suspended in waiting energy. You're grounded. And that ground feels firmer than before. Stay right here, because firmness changes the dynamic. It removes the illusion that time will stretch forever. It makes every choice feel more consequential. And that realization weighs on them. Listen closely now, because they're starting to understand that love doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades through neglect, avoidance, and fear of discomfort. And once they see that, they can't unsee it. Stay with me, because this is where grief transforms. It's no longer just grief over what might be lost. It's grief over the version of themselves that didn't know how to show up differently. That grief is quiet, but deep. Listen carefully, because they may also feel shame, but not the kind that collapses. The kind that motivates reflection. Shame that says, I could have been braver. That realization is painful, but it's also a seed. Stay right here, because seeds don't bloom immediately. They sit in the dark for a while. And this stage is dark. Not hopeless, but uncertain. Full of questions without clear direction. Listen closely now, because uncertainty is where real choice lives. Not choice driven by impulse or fear, but choice driven by values. And your soulmate is being forced to confront their values now. Stay with me, because one of those values is honesty. And honesty, once felt deeply, doesn't go away. It demands expression eventually, in one form or another. Listen carefully, because if they do reach out, it will come from this space, not desperation, but reckoning. Not performance, but humility. And if they don't, that decision will also be shaped by this awareness. Stay right here, because either way, something important has already happened. The truth surfaced. The silence broke internally. And that changes the emotional landscape permanently. Listen closely now, because you are not responsible for carrying them through this process. Their growth belongs to them. Your growth belongs to you. And both matter equally. Stay with me, because what you shared mattered enough to leave a mark. You weren't a passing moment. You were a mirror they couldn't look away from forever. Breathe. This part of the story isn't about resolution yet. It's about consequence. About awareness. About the slow, uncomfortable transformation that happens when someone finally feels what they avoided. And whatever comes next, it will come from a place where truth has already done its work. Stay with me, because this part is where everything becomes painfully honest in a way that can't be undone. This is the phase where your soulmate stops asking abstract questions and starts facing real consequences. Not in a dramatic, life-changing announcement kind of way, but in quiet moments that hit harder than any confrontation ever could. Moments where they realize that even if they feel everything now, feelings alone don't rewind time. Listen carefully, because something subtle but important has changed in how they think about you. You're no longer just a memory or a feeling they can push aside when it gets uncomfortable. You've become a reference point. Every interaction, every potential connection, every emotional choice now gets compared,